An elderly woman received an invitation to her son's wedding. But when she arrived at the venue, what she saw left her trembling. Evelyn Thompson, an elderly woman with graying hair and hands wrinkled by years of hard work, sat quietly in the small living room of her modest house in the village of St. James. It was a humble home, with dark wooden walls and worn-out carpets that bore the marks of decades of sacrifice and memories. Although time had left its mark on every corner, the house still breathed life, a life made up of memories that Evelyn refused to leave behind. The elderly woman rocked slowly in the old chair that her late husband had built for her many years ago. The creak of the wood accompanied the crackling of the fire in the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls covered with faded photographs of her son John in various stages of his childhood. Even though the images had lost their color over time, John's face in them still held a vitality that filled her with both nostalgia and pain. In front of her, a small shelf held the most treasured relics of her life, trophies from chess tournaments where John had competed as a child, school diplomas, and a collection of small wooden carvings that he had crafted with his tiny hands. Evelyn closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself be carried away by the echo of past laughter. She remembered how he used to sit on the floor beside her, his little face focused, working on those figures as he told her about his dreams of greatness. She would look at him tenderly, silently vowing to herself that she would do everything in her power to make those dreams come true. With trembling fingers, she picked up one of the photos from the shelf, a blurry image of John, just 10 years old, holding a small trophy with pride after winning a local chess tournament. His expression was one of pure happiness, his smile lighting up the entire scene. Evelyn remembered that day as if it were yesterday. She had worked extra shifts at the town's laundry to pay for the chess lessons and the tournament fee. She had spent sleepless nights washing and ironing clothes until dawn, but it hadn't mattered. The sparkle in her son's eyes when he held that cup had erased every trace of exhaustion. However, the passionate and grateful child who had been her little champion had changed over the years. The shared moments had faded, and as John grew older, he began to drift away like a tide receding beyond reach. At first, Evelyn told herself that it was normal, that all children grow distant as they age. But the distance between them wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The weekly letters and calls turned into sporadic messages, each one more formal and distant than the last. She still kept each one of those letters in a small drawer, all with a tone so impersonal that it hurt her more than silence itself. Dear Mum, I hope you're doing well. Everything here is very busy, but I promise to visit soon. John. The words seemed written by a stranger, not by the boy she had raised alone with so much love and effort. And then, 3 years ago, the letters stopped altogether. Silence fell between them like a concrete wall, and Evelyn's life shrank to waiting, clinging to memories as her only companions. The small village of St. James wasn't big, and everyone knew about John's success in the big city. At first, the neighbors congratulated her, saying how proud she must be to have raised such a successful man. But over time, those same neighbors began to look at her with pity, wondering why he never visited or why he never mentioned his mother. They whispered behind her back when she walked through the market, and more than once, Evelyn overheard the cruel remarks that haunted her. A mother who gave everything, and he doesn't even remember her, commented a woman with a frown one afternoon as Evelyn bought some bread at the local bakery. The elderly woman lowered her head, pretending not to have heard. Her closest neighbor, Mrs. Clara, had always been the most blunt of all. Clara had been Evelyn's friend since their youth and had supported her when she was widowed, but she never held back on sharing her thoughts. One morning, as Evelyn watered the plants in her small garden, Clara leaned against the fence separating their houses, arms crossed and eyebrows furrowed. Evelyn, I'm telling you this because I care about you. That son of yours only thinks about himself. Clara's tone was stern, but her gaze was full of concern. You spend your life defending the indefensible. What kind of son leaves his mother all alone? Evelyn, chin held high and eyes filled with a mixture of pain and pride, turned to face her friend. John is a very busy man, Clara. He has important responsibilities. You can't expect a businessman to have time for small things like... Her voice broke a little. Visiting his mother in the countryside. Clara shook her head, sighing in frustration. Yes, but is he really too busy to make a phone call in 3 years? Too busy to remember who raised him? Evelyn didn't respond. She simply looked down, feeling the tears burn her eyes. But she held them back. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry, wouldn't show weakness, because even in the midst of her pain, she still held on to a spark of hope. Despite everything, she still believed that John loved her, and that one day he would return. That night, when she sat in her rocking chair, cradling John's old letters like they were a treasure, something unexpected happened. The sound of the postman leaving mail broke the quiet. Evelyn stood up with effort and opened the door to collect what seemed to be an elegant, strangely heavy letter. Her eyes widened as she saw the embossed seal with golden letters. Opening it carefully, she read the words that nearly brought her to her knees. Mrs. Evelyn Thompson, you are cordially invited to the wedding ceremony of your son, John Thompson, and Rebecca Stewart. Evelyn let the letter slip through her fingers, unable to fully process what she had just read. Her son. Was he getting married? And why was he inviting her now after all this time? Did this mean he wanted to include her in his life again? A storm of emotions overwhelmed her. Joy, fear, and a deep uncertainty swirled within her chest. After years of silence, John was finally extending a bridge to her. But should she cross it? Evelyn slowly sank back into her rocking chair, clutching the letter to her chest. In that moment, she knew only one thing. She had to go. No matter what she found on the other side, she needed to attend that wedding and see her son one more time. Because she still believed that, somewhere deep in his heart, he still remembered her with the same love she held for him. Evelyn closed her eyes, allowing the tears to flow freely down her cheeks. For the first time in years, the silence of her home seemed filled with something new, hope. Evelyn glanced at the letter over and over again, as if by doing so she could read between the lines and uncover John's true intentions. Why, after 3 long years of silence, was he inviting her to one of the most important days of his life? Was it a genuine gesture of reconciliation, or just a formal obligation he felt compelled to fulfill? Doubts assaulted her with every passing minute. Seated at the small kitchen table, the elderly woman watched the letter under the dim light of the lamp, while the clock on the wall marked the hours, slow and relentless. "Should I go?" she whispered into the empty air, as if the house itself, filled with echoes of her past life, could give her an answer. She couldn't help but recall the day she traveled to the city to surprise John at his office. After months of not hearing from him, she had summoned all the courage she had left and made the long journey from St. James to the bustling urban centre. She had arrived carrying a small box of cake she had baked with her own hands, something he had always loved. But when she reached the elegant office where he worked, his assistant didn't even allow her to go up. "Mr. Thompson is busy, ma'am," the young woman had said dismissively from behind her marble desk. "He doesn't receive visitors without an appointment." Evelyn had tried to explain that she was his mother, that she only wanted to see her son, but the words died in her throat when the assistant raised an eyebrow and gave her a cold stare, as if she were a nuisance, a distraction in the middle of her son's busy day. She had stood there in the sleek lobby of the upscale office building, clutching her small box of cake as tears threatened to spill over. In the end, she left, accepting defeat, telling herself she shouldn't interrupt him. He had more important things to do. But now, with the letter in her hands, something inside her rebelled against that resignation. If John was inviting her, there had to be a reason, right? Maybe, just maybe, he wanted to reconnect with her. It was a chance she couldn't afford to pass up, even if it meant facing more pain. "Evelyn, are you all right?" Mrs. Clara's voice broke through her thoughts. Mrs. Clara, her neighbor and friend of many years, stepped into the kitchen uninvited, as she often did, and froze when she saw the letter on the table. Her brow furrowed as she looked at Evelyn with a mix of concern and skepticism. "What's that?" she asked, nodding towards the elegant paper. "It's—" Evelyn swallowed hard and took a deep breath. "It's an invitation to John's wedding." Clara's eyes widened. She blinked several times, incredulous, then sat down across from Evelyn, pulling her glasses out of her pocket to take a closer look at the letter. "After all this time, he's inviting you to his wedding," Clara murmured, reading the text slowly. "And he hasn't even bothered to call you once." Evelyn lowered her gaze and shrugged, trying to keep her composure, but the tremble in her hands gave her away. Maybe he couldn't call me. Or he was busy." Evelyn's voice sounded weak, even to her own ears. Clara set the letter down on the table with a soft but firm tap and looked at her intently. "Don't be naive, Evelyn. I don't want you getting your hopes up. That son of yours—" She sighed heavily, her tone softening a little. "I don't want to see you get hurt again." "Clara, he's my son," Evelyn replied, raising her chin proudly, even though her eyes betrayed the anguish she felt. "No matter what's happened, he's still my son. And if he's inviting me, it means he wants me there. I can't turn him down." Clara closed her eyes for a moment, as if trying to rein in her frustration, then nodded slowly, resigned. "So, are you planning to go?" she asked, looking at her intensely. Evelyn remained silent, her thoughts spinning in a whirlwind. She knew that going meant facing not only the reality of how much John had changed, but also the possible humiliation of being treated like a stranger in her own family. But just receiving the invitation, having that small door opened, filled her with a yearning she couldn't ignore. He was her son. How could she refuse to stand by his side on such an important day, even if it meant facing heartache? "Yes, I'm going to go," she affirmed, her voice stronger than she expected. "I can't stay here and wonder what if... I have to go." Clara watched her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right. But you're not going in that old dress you wear to church," she said sternly, though her tone was filled with maternal warmth. Evelyn felt a knot of gratitude tighten in her throat. "We're going to find something that makes you look like the mother of the groom you are. Something that, if that woman tries to humiliate you, will make her bite her tongue." Evelyn gave a faint smile, thankful for her friend's support. She knew Mrs. Clara didn't approve of John or his behavior, but she was still willing to help. Together, they spent the following days searching through local shops for something Evelyn could wear. After much searching, they found a simple dress in a deep shade of blue that highlighted her eyes and gave her an air of quiet dignity. It wasn't ostentatious, but Evelyn felt good when she tried it on, almost as if the reflection in the mirror was a version of herself she hadn't seen in years. "You look beautiful," murmured Clara with a small smile. "If John has an ounce of decency, he'll realize how much effort you've put in just for him." Evelyn sighed softly and nodded. "I hope so," she murmured softly, clasping her hands in front of her. "I really hope so." The day before her departure, Evelyn prepared herself meticulously. She spent everything she had left on a train ticket to the big city. When she realized she still didn't have enough, Clara insisted on lending her a little more, despite Evelyn's protests. "Take it," Clara said firmly, pressing the bills into her hand. "Consider it an investment in your peace of mind." Evelyn, moved, accepted the money and carefully tucked it into her old purse. On the morning of her trip, she rose before dawn. As the sun timidly peeked over the horizon, Evelyn said goodbye to her little home, casting one last look at every corner as if fearing she might never see it again. She gently caressed the rocking chair her husband had built, then picked up the small suitcase she had packed the night before. When she arrived at the train station, it was bustling with people, yet Evelyn felt completely alone amidst the crowd. The train arrived with a loud whistle and the screech of brakes, and she boarded with hesitant steps, clutching the invitation tightly in her lap as she settled into her seat. As the train began to move, Evelyn gazed out the window, watching as the rural landscape of St. James faded into the distance, replaced first by endless fields and then by the cold concrete of the big city. Doubts began to creep back into her mind. What if Clara was right? What if John didn't want her there at all? What if this was just a formality? But Evelyn forced herself to push those thoughts away. She had to be strong. She had to cling to the hope that this was her chance to see her son again, to hold him, to tell him how much she had missed him. When the train finally pulled into the city station, Evelyn took a deep breath, trying to steady her trembling hands. She stepped off with a determined stride, though her heart was pounding. She didn't know what awaited her at this wedding, but she was resolved to be there. Because, despite everything, he was her son. And if this was the only way to regain their lost connection, then she was willing to risk everything. With the letter carefully tucked into her purse and her small blue dress draped over her shoulders, Evelyn lifted her chin and took a taxi to the address listed in the invitation, the Grand Stuart Mansion. As the vehicle moved through streets filled with towering buildings and dazzling lights, Evelyn couldn't help but feel a mix of excitement and fear. She would see John soon, and no matter what happened, she was determined to let him know that, no matter how far he went, she would always be there for him. Because she hadn't traveled just to attend a wedding, she had traveled to reclaim her son. The taxi stopped in front of the imposing Stuart Mansion, a building that looked like something out of a fairy tale, surrounded by tall iron gates and vast gardens filled with sculptures and fountains. Evelyn stepped out of the car with a mixture of awe and nerves, feeling small and out of place amidst the grandeur that surrounded her. The towering walls and golden lights illuminating the entrance seemed designed to keep people like her out, not to welcome them in. But Evelyn didn't let fear paralyze her. She took a deep breath, adjusted the simple blue dress that had taken so much effort to buy, and walked up to the main entrance with the invitation in hand. The stone pavement echoed under her steps, and the sound seemed as loud as if the entire mansion were watching her. As she approached the doors, two guards dressed in identical black suits with stern expressions stepped forward to intercept her. They looked her up and down, taking in the modest dress and the trembling hands that held the envelope with the Stuart logo. Evelyn, trying to appear more confident than she felt, handed them the invitation with a small smile. "Good evening. I'm here for my son's wedding, John Thompson," she said, attempting to keep her voice steady despite the anxiety tightening her chest. The guards exchanged a brief glance before one of them took the letter and examined it carefully. The silence stretched on, and Evelyn could feel the weight of their stares evaluating her. After a minute that felt like an eternity, one of them nodded slowly. "Yes, her name is on the list," he said in a monotone voice, handing the letter back to her. "You may go in, ma'am." The coldness in his tone and the way they looked at her made Evelyn feel a tight knot form in her stomach. There was no courtesy in their gestures, only the impersonal attitude of someone fulfilling a duty. As she moved forward, she felt her cheeks burn with shame, aware that she didn't belong in a place like this. Around her, the gardens were adorned with bright lights and delicate garlands hanging from the trees, and the air was filled with the scent of exotic flowers she had never smelled before. Upon reaching the main entrance, a stiff-looking butler guided her through the foyer, where marble floors gleamed and the ceilings arched in majestic curves. The mansion was so opulent that Evelyn could hardly believe what she was seeing. The walls were adorned with golden tapestries, and crystal chandeliers cast sparkling reflections that created a dreamlike atmosphere. But as she moved further, the murmurs of the guests and their inquisitive gazes followed her like a shadow. Men and women in expensive suits and designer dresses turned to look at her, whispering as she passed by. Evelyn could feel their eyes judging her, scrutinizing every detail of her appearance and posture. She felt each of those stares like needles piercing her skin. She pressed her hands against the folds of her dress, wishing she could disappear. She knew that her presence there was unwelcome, but she hadn't come for them. She had come to see her son. She entered the main hall where the ceremony was to take place. The high ceiling was adorned with delicate garlands and chandeliers, and the chairs were arranged in perfect rows, draped in white satin fabrics. Around the grand hall, the most distinguished members of high society stood in small groups, conversing and laughing with perfect smiles. Evelyn felt like an insect trapped in a room full of predatory birds. She took a deep breath and, with hesitant steps, began looking for John among the crowd. And then she saw him. John was on the other side of the hall, standing next to Rebecca, who wore a dazzling white dress that made her look like a queen. He was dressed in a black tuxedo that enhanced his elegant stature. He looked so different from the cheerful young man Evelyn remembered. The forced smile on his face and the stiffness in his posture unsettled her. Where was the warmth in his eyes? Where was the boy who used to look at her with pride and love? Evelyn felt her chest tighten as she watched her son, who now seemed like a distant figure, a stranger to her. "Oh, but if it isn't the groom's mother!" The cold, syrupy voice of Rebecca made Evelyn turn sharply. Rebecca approached with graceful steps and a polite smile that didn't reach her eyes. She was a young and beautiful woman with perfect features and impeccable manners, but there was something in her expression that put Evelyn on guard. Her eyes scanned her, as if evaluating every one of her flaws, from the simple hairstyle to the worn-out shoes Evelyn wore. "What a surprise to have you here," Rebecca continued, tilting her head slightly. "We didn't expect you to arrive so early." There was a slight hesitation in her voice, and the fake smile widened a little more. "I'm afraid, given the change of plans, you might prefer a more appropriate place to view the ceremony." Evelyn blinked, feeling the blood freeze in her veins. "Change of plans?" she asked, trying not to sound as uncertain as she felt. Rebecca nodded, her voice dripping with a sweetness that only made her words seem more cruel. "Oh, don't worry, Mrs. Thompson," she said, looking at her as one would look at a child who doesn't understand something. "Please, come with me. I'm sure you'll prefer a place where you can enjoy the ceremony quietly without feeling overwhelmed." Before Evelyn could respond, Rebecca took her by the arm and led her to the edge of the hall, where a large curtain separated the main area from the service section. When the curtain was drawn back, Evelyn held her breath. There were no elegant seats, no luxurious decorations. Instead, she found herself in a small side room with plain chairs and a television mounted in the corner. It was the area where the servants and staff could watch the wedding from a distance. "You'll be more comfortable here, Mrs. Thompson," Rebecca said, that sharp smile still on her face. "You don't want to be caught up in all the hustle and bustle." Evelyn felt her cheeks burn. The rejection and humiliation washed over her like a wave of ice. She knew that Rebecca was pushing her away from John, that she wanted to hide her as if she were an embarrassment, a stain on the perfect event she was organizing. But before she could say anything, 2 household staff members approached and gently took her by the arms, guiding her to a seat in the corner of the room. "Enjoy the show, Mrs. Thompson," Rebecca murmured, turning and walking away with the same controlled grace with which she had arrived. Evelyn stood there, still clutching the invitation in her hand, tears burning in her eyes. She knew that if she moved, if she tried to protest, she would only make a fool of herself. The servants looked at her with a mix of pity and sympathy. Some averted their eyes, others watched her with curiosity, but no one said a word. Evelyn closed her eyes and let herself sink into the small metal chair. The letter that had meant so much to her was now nothing more than a reminder of how much they despised her. Rebecca had made it clear that she wasn't welcome among the guests. She was just a stranger, the humble mother of a man who had grown up to be someone very different from the boy she had raised. But just as she was about to give in to the sadness, a slight movement to her left caught her attention. She turned her head and saw a small figure hiding behind a column. It was a little girl, with tangled dark hair and big eyes filled with tears. Evelyn looked at her, puzzled, and the girl stepped forward with a pleading expression. "Please," whispered the child, her voice barely audible above the murmur of the room. "Can you help me? I don't want to be here. Rebecca hates me and told me not to speak to anyone, but I just want to go home with my dad." Evelyn felt her stomach twist as she looked at her, unable to fully comprehend what she was hearing. Who was this child? Why was she speaking about Rebecca like that? But before she could say anything, Rebecca's voice echoed from the nearby hallway. "Sophie!" The sharp voice rang out, making the girl immediately retreat back into the shadows. Evelyn barely had time to gently push the child into a hidden corner before Rebecca appeared, her face tense, a deep frown etched across her features. She looked at Evelyn with that smile as cold as the night itself and murmured in a low voice, "I hope you're enjoying the ceremony, Mrs. Thompson. Remember, don't cause any trouble." And with those words, she left, leaving Evelyn standing there, trembling with confusion and fear. In that moment, Evelyn knew something was deeply wrong in that mansion, something she needed to uncover. Evelyn sat alone in the small service room, far from the splendor of the wedding. She could hear the laughter of the guests, the clinking of glasses, and the soft music drifting in from the main hall. Everything seemed so distant, so out of reach. She clenched her hands tightly on her lap, trying to suppress the humiliation she felt. But every time she closed her eyes, the image of little Sophie flashed in her mind, with those large eyes full of fear and desperation. "Rebecca hates me. I just want to go home with my dad." The child's words echoed again and again in her head. What did it all mean? Why was a child, in the midst of this perfect, opulent wedding, so terrified? And more importantly, why did she refer to John as her father? Just as Evelyn was lost in thought, she sensed a presence beside her. She looked up, startled, and saw an elegantly dressed elderly woman watching her with a kind but cautious expression. The woman had silver hair tied back in a neat bun and wore a dark velvet dress that exuded class and authority. Despite her refined appearance, there was something in her gaze that conveyed warmth, something that made Evelyn feel truly seen for the first time since she had arrived at this mansion. "I'm sorry to interrupt," the woman said softly, leaning slightly towards Evelyn. "But are you John's mother?" Evelyn nodded slowly, still taken aback by the stranger's sudden appearance. "Yes, I'm Evelyn Thompson. And you are—" She let the question linger, hoping the woman would introduce herself. "Margaret Spencer," the elderly woman replied with a faint smile. "I've been a friend of the Stewart family for many years." She paused, as if weighing the situation carefully. "But I'm not here as a guest. I'm here because I thought you might need support." Evelyn looked at her, confused. Support? Why would she say that? "What they did by relegating you here is inexcusable," Margaret continued, a flash of indignation in her eyes. "Rebecca and her father believe people are disposable, and when they're no longer useful, they push them aside. But I didn't want you to feel alone, so I came to see you." Evelyn felt her eyes fill with tears of gratitude. It was the first time since arriving that someone had spoken to her with genuine kindness. "Thank you, Mrs. Spencer, but I don't understand. Why are you here with me? Shouldn't you be enjoying the wedding with everyone else?" Margaret let out a soft, almost ironic laugh. "Enjoy this?" Her eyes darkened slightly. "No, dear. I'm here because I know what the Stewarts are capable of, and I know this isn't the first time they've tried to manipulate someone's life." Evelyn leaned in closer, feeling her heart begin to race. "What do you mean?" Margaret gestured for her to follow. They discreetly left the service room and ventured down a side hallway, away from the bustling crowd of guests. When they reached a small, empty library, Margaret turned to Evelyn with a grave expression. "What I'm about to tell you, Mrs. Thompson, won't be easy to hear, but I believe you need to know." She sighed, as if the words were a burden she had carried for far too long. "John is not the man Rebecca thinks he is, and this wedding isn't just a marriage. It's a deal, a business agreement." Margaret paused, looking at her intensely. "The Stuarts have been manipulating your son from the start, using his ambitions and dreams to bind him to them. But there's something else you need to know. Sophie." Evelyn's breath caught. She knew that name would come up again. The frightened little girl she had met wouldn't leave her thoughts. "Who is Sophie?" she whispered, dreading the answer. "Sophie is John's daughter," Margaret replied firmly. Evelyn felt the ground shift beneath her feet. She shook her head slowly, unable to process what she had just heard. How can that be?" she whispered, clutching one of the nearby chairs for support. "John never told me he had a daughter." Margaret looked at her with compassion. "Because he doesn't know," Margaret revealed in a low voice. "When John met Rebecca, he had already been in a relationship with a humble woman named Anne. Anne died shortly after giving birth to Sophie, and Rebecca took advantage of that tragedy to ensure John would never know the truth." Margaret lowered her gaze, as if recalling something painful. The Stuarts couldn't allow their perfect union with John to be overshadowed by the existence of an illegitimate child. So they hid Sophie away, keeping her under their control in this mansion. Evelyn felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over her. How was it possible that her own son didn't know he had a daughter? How could they be so cruel? "Why didn't anyone tell him?" she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Because if John knew the truth, the entire arrangement would fall apart," Margaret replied. "The Stuarts control his company, his finances, everything. Rebecca has made him believe that without her, he's nothing. And if John found out Sophie is his daughter, he might claim her as his own. He might break the contract and take control of everything. That's why they've kept Sophie in the shadows, treating her like a shameful secret. And they plan to send her to a boarding school in Europe as soon as the wedding is over. They want her out of his life forever." Evelyn felt a tight knot form in her stomach. Now she understood why Sophie had been so frightened, why she spoke of Rebecca with such fear. They were using her as a pawn in their power games. And John was trapped in the middle without even knowing it. "I have to tell him," Evelyn murmured, taking a step toward the door. "I have to tell John the truth. He deserves to know." But Margaret stopped her, gently holding her arm. "It won't be that easy," she warned. "Rebecca and her father have built a wall around him. If you try to talk to him without proof, they'll discredit you and make you seem like a crazy old woman trying to destroy her son's life." Margaret's eyes softened. "You need to be smart, Evelyn. You need proof. If you really want to save John and Sophie, you have to find something the Stuarts can't deny." Evelyn felt the weight of Margaret's words. She couldn't just burst into the middle of the ceremony and shout the truth. She needed proof, something tangible that showed the Stuarts had manipulated everything from the start. "How can I find this proof?" she asked, her voice trembling but determined. Margaret gave her a small, sad smile. "William Stuart has a private office on the upper floor. He keeps all his confidential documents there. If you can find John's original will and any letters from Anne, you'll have the evidence you need to expose the truth. But be careful. If they catch you, they won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to silence you." Evelyn swallowed hard, feeling a chill run down her spine. She knew this was dangerous, that standing up to the Stuarts could destroy her, but she couldn't just stand by, not now that she knew the truth. "I'll do it," she said, lifting her head with determination. "I'll find those documents and get my son and granddaughter out of these people's clutches." Margaret nodded, looking at her with something akin to admiration. "You're stronger than you look, Evelyn." She gave her a gentle squeeze on the arm. "You're not alone in this. I'll help you as much as I can. But be careful. The Stuarts don't forgive those who stand in their way." Evelyn took a deep breath, feeling a new strength ignite within her. She knew what she had to do. She was going to save John and Sophie, even if it meant going up against the entire Stuart family. As she left the library, her heart pounding, only one thought echoed in her mind. "I won't give up. Not now. Not when my son and granddaughter need me more than ever." It was time to uncover the truth. Evelyn walked through the opulent halls of the mansion with light but determined steps. The walls were adorned with elegant paintings of pastoral landscapes and portraits of ancestors with stern expressions. The silence on the upper floors contrasted sharply with the festive commotion that rumbled below. Every corner of that house seemed to radiate power and wealth, but all Evelyn felt was an oppressive atmosphere, as if something dark lurked behind every closed door. After her conversation with Margaret, Evelyn knew she had to act quickly. There was no time to hesitate. Sophie was in danger, and if she didn't find proof of the Stuarts' crimes, that innocent child would be banished from John's life forever. But she needed to proceed with caution. The Stuart mansion was a labyrinth of luxury and secrets, and she was just an elderly woman, armed only with the courage of a desperate mother. She paused for a moment to get her bearings, trying to remember Margaret's directions. The upper floor was almost deserted. Most of the guests were still in the grand hall on the main level. Evelyn seized the opportunity to move unnoticed. She walked down the carpeted hallway with quick but silent movements, sticking close to the walls and avoiding the gaze of the few servants who passed by. William Stuart's private office, the patriarch of the family, was at the end of a long corridor decorated with heavy red velvet curtains and massive porcelain vases. But before she reached it, a small sound, barely a whisper, reached her ears. Evelyn stopped dead in her tracks and strained to listen. It came from a door slightly ajar to her right, a dark and secluded room. At first she thought of moving on, but something in that sound stirred her maternal instinct. She approached cautiously and gently pushed the door open. Inside, dimly lit by a single lamp, she saw a small figure curled up on the floor, knees hugged tightly to her chest. It was Sophie. The child was hiding in the shadows, her dark hair falling over her face and her shoulders shaking slightly. Evelyn felt her heart clench at the sight of her so vulnerable. "Sophie," she whispered softly, stepping closer carefully so as not to frighten her. The girl lifted her head abruptly and looked at her with large, fearful eyes. Evelyn knelt beside her, and when Sophie recognized her, she let out a soft sob and threw herself into Evelyn's arms, burying her face in the elderly woman's lap. "Don't leave me alone," the little one murmured, her voice broken by sobs. "Rebecca wants to send me away. She wants to send me far, and I don't want to go. I want to stay with my dad." Evelyn felt a knot tighten in her stomach as she listened to those words. Gently, she stroked the girl's hair, trying to soothe her. "Don't worry, Sophie." Evelyn's voice was firm, though her heart broke with every word. "I won't let them hurt you, but I need your help. I need to understand what's going on here. Can you tell me?" Sophie pulled back slightly, looking up at her with those big, tear-filled eyes. She nodded slowly, still trembling, and sat on the floor with her legs crossed. Evelyn knelt in front of her, ignoring the pain in her aging knees, determined to listen. "Rebecca has always been mean to me," Sophie whispered, speaking so softly that it seemed as if she feared the walls might hear her. "Ever since Mommy died, she's been here." She rubbed her eyes with the back of her hand. "She told me that my dad never wanted me, that I'm just a burden, and that once she marries him, she'll send me far, far away, so he can be happy without me." Evelyn felt fury and sorrow surge within her. How could someone say such cruel things to such a small child? But she forced herself to stay calm. Sophie needed her support, not her anger. "That's not true, sweetie," she said softly, taking the little girl's hands in her own. "Your dad doesn't know you're here, does he?" Sophie shook her head, biting her lower lip nervously. "No." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Rebecca keeps me hidden. She says if Dad finds out about me, it would ruin everything he's built. But I just want him to love me." Evelyn felt tears sting her eyes. All Sophie wanted was her father's love, the same love that Evelyn herself longed for from John. The little girl was a reflection of her own loneliness, and Evelyn knew at that moment that she had to do everything in her power to reunite them. "Listen, Sophie," she said firmly, leaning closer. "I'm not going to let them take you away, but I need your help to find something that will stop Rebecca, something that will show your dad the truth. Do you know where Rebecca keeps her important things?" Sophie nodded slowly. "Yes. Sometimes I hear Rebecca and her dad talking in the big office upstairs." She pointed toward the staircase that led to the upper floor. "They always close the door and talk quietly. They don't want me to hear." Evelyn gently squeezed the girl's hands. "Good. Then that's what I'm going to do." She looked at Sophie seriously. "You stay here hidden. Don't make a sound, okay? Don't let them find you." Sophie looked up at her fearfully, but nodded again. Evelyn stood up carefully, feeling the pain in her knees, and leaned down to kiss the girl's forehead. "I'll come back for you," she whispered. "I promise." Sophie nodded once more and scrambled into the darkest corner of the room, covering herself with an old blanket she found. Evelyn watched her for a moment, wishing she could stay to comfort her longer, but she had no choice. If she wanted to save Sophie and John, she had to act now. She slipped out of the room and climbed the stairs with light steps. The halls of the upper floor were deserted, and the echo of her footsteps whispered softly in the still air. At the end of the corridor, she saw the closed door Sophie had mentioned. It was a heavy, dark wooden door, adorned with golden moldings. Without wasting any time, Evelyn approached and, with her heart pounding, slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open slightly. Evelyn held her breath as she stepped inside the study. The room was impressive, with walls lined with shelves full of leather-bound books and a massive mahogany desk in the center. The light from a floor lamp cast long shadows across the room, filling the atmosphere with an air of secrecy. Wasting no time, Evelyn began searching the desk, opening drawers and sifting through papers with trembling fingers. She didn't know exactly what she was looking for, but she knew there had to be something here. Some document that would prove what Margaret had told her. She found contracts, financial reports, letters with formal headers, but nothing that mentioned Sophie or John's will. Her desperation grew with each passing second. But then, in the last drawer, hidden behind a thick stack of folders, she spotted something that caught her attention. A brown envelope with John Thompson's name written in elegant cursive. Evelyn pulled the envelope out with trembling hands and quickly opened it. Inside, she found several letters that Anne, Sophie's mother, had written before she died. In each one, Anne begged John to take care of their daughter, spoke of how much she loved him, and pleaded for him not to let Sophie grow up without knowing who her real father was. Evelyn felt a lump in her throat as she read the words filled with pain and love. Anne had tried to warn John, had fought to keep the truth alive, but Rebecca and William had destroyed everything. And behind the letters, she found a legal document, John's original will, naming Sophie as his primary heir in the event something happened to him. If this document were to reach John, Rebecca would lose everything, Evelyn thought, horror growing within her. That's why they've kept Sophie hidden. Because if John knew the truth, their entire house of cards would come crashing down. The sound of footsteps in the hallway jolted her out of her thoughts. Evelyn quickly stuffed the letters and the will into her purse and turned toward the door. She didn't have time to hide. She needed to get out before they found her. With her heart racing, she slipped out of the study and carefully closed the door behind her. The footsteps were getting closer. Evelyn pressed herself against the wall, praying no one would see her, and slid down the hallway toward the far end. As she rounded the corner, she came face to face with Margaret. "Did you find it?" the older woman whispered, looking at Evelyn with anxious eyes. Evelyn nodded, shaking off the tension that had built up. Yes, but we don't have much time. I need to get this to John before Rebecca realizes it's gone. Margaret nodded slowly, her expression serious. Be careful. The Stuarts won't back down easily. Evelyn looked at her with unwavering determination. It doesn't matter. I won't let them destroy my son, or my granddaughter. With those words, she turned and began to descend the stairs, the evidence safely tucked away in her purse. It was time to face Rebecca, and this time, she wasn't leaving without a fight. Evelyn moved through the mansion's halls with her hands tightly gripping the purse that held the proof. She knew that she now had the only chance to expose the Stuarts for what they truly were, manipulators and liars who had taken advantage of her son and kept her granddaughter hidden away as a shameful secret. But to confront them, she had to act swiftly and precisely. She couldn't afford a single mistake. When she reached the ground floor, the atmosphere of the wedding had subtly shifted. There was more tension in the air, as if something unseen had disturbed the surface calm. The guests, holding champagne glasses and wearing artificial smiles, spoke quietly, whispering rumors and glancing at every move the Stuarts made. Rebecca stood in the center of the grand hall, radiating a cold elegance in her white wedding dress that fell in perfect folds around her. Beside her, John stood rigid as a statue, his face blank and distant. Evelyn took a deep breath, trying to steady the tremble in her hands. She knew that confronting Rebecca and William wouldn't be easy. They were in control of the situation, and one wrong word could turn everything against her. But she couldn't remain silent. Not after what she had seen and read in the study. With firm steps, she pushed through the crowd, feeling the eyes of the guests settle on her. Some frowned, others whispered to their companions, but Evelyn paid them no mind. Her only goal was to reach John. She had to talk to him before Rebecca noticed her presence, but just as she was about to cross into the main part of the hall, the imposing figure of William Stuart appeared beside her, blocking her path. "Where do you think you're going, Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, in a low, dangerous tone, a thin, warning smile on his lips. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine, but she didn't back down. She lifted her chin and looked him straight in the eye. "I'm going to speak to my son," she replied firmly. William raised an eyebrow, then let out a humorless chuckle. "I'm afraid you don't have that right," he murmured, leaning closer, his voice a venomous whisper. "John is about to seal the most important deal of his life. We don't need you barging in and ruining things." "Seal the deal?" Evelyn looked at him incredulously. "This isn't a business transaction. This is my son's life. He has the right to know the truth." "The truth," William repeated, looking upward as if considering the word. "The truth is relative, Mrs. Thompson. My daughter Rebecca has been a loyal partner to John. Without her, he wouldn't be the man he is today." He leaned even closer, his eyes glinting with a cruel light. "Don't ruin everything because of some nostalgic fantasy of a happy family. If you try to speak to John, you'll destroy it all." Evelyn felt anger flare inside her. She tightened her grip on her purse, making sure the evidence was still there. "You're the one destroying his life, not me," she shot back, her voice trembling slightly with the intensity of her emotions. "John deserves to know the truth. He deserves to know he has a daughter. And you," she lowered her voice, staring at him with a hatred she had never felt before. "You've been lying to him all this time." William's smile disappeared. His eyes hardened as he took a step closer, towering over her. "Leave now, Mrs. Thompson, before I'm forced to do something we'll both regret." Evelyn held his gaze, her heart pounding furiously. But just as she was about to respond, a voice called out from across the hall. "Mom!" Evelyn turned her head and saw John breaking away from Rebecca and striding quickly toward them. There was surprise on his face, but also something else. Something Evelyn hadn't seen in a long time. Concern. Rebecca tried to stop him, placing a hand on his arm, but he gently pushed her aside and continued toward his mother. "What are you doing here?" he asked in a low but intense voice as he reached her side. Evelyn felt a surge of relief and sorrow all at once. He was right in front of her, looking her in the eyes. But there were so many things she wanted to say to him, so many questions to ask, that for a moment she found herself speechless. Around them, the guests watched with growing interest, the whispers rising. I came because I needed to see you," she finally said, her voice trembling. "But John, there's something I need to show you. It's very important." John frowned, confused. "Show me? What are you talking about?" Evelyn opened her purse and carefully pulled out the will and Anne's letters. The documents trembled slightly in her hands as she held them out to John. This is what the Stuarts have been hiding from you," she said urgently. "Please, son, read it. See the truth for yourself." John looked at her incredulously, then glanced down at the papers. Slowly, he took the will from her hands and began to read. As his eyes moved over the lines, his expression shifted. First, confusion, then disbelief, and finally, a pain so deep that Evelyn felt her heart break at the sight. What is this?" he murmured, lifting his gaze with wide eyes. "Sophie? Sophie is my daughter?" Evelyn nodded, tears filling her eyes. "Yes, John, and Rebecca has known all along. They've been hiding her from you, keeping her away to manipulate you and make you believe you have nothing outside of this marriage." John staggered, taking a step back. His face was pale, and the look of betrayal in his eyes was almost unbearable to see. "No, it can't be," he murmured, shaking his head. "Rebecca, did you know about this?" Rebecca, who had silently approached during the conversation, struggled to maintain her composure. Her face was tense, but a controlled smile still clung to her lips. "John, please don't listen to your mother," she said softly, reaching out to him. "She doesn't understand. She's confused. She just wants to ruin this special day for us." John looked at her incredulously, and then his expression turned hard, filled with barely contained rage. "Confused?" he repeated, his voice rising. "Confused? Rebecca, these are letters from Anne." He lifted the letters, waving them in front of her. "The mother of my daughter. How could you keep something like this from me?" Rebecca blinked, stepping back slightly. "John, it's not what you think. Everything I've done, I did for you, to protect you, so you wouldn't be distracted by things that don't matter." "Don't matter!" John's voice was a roar now, echoing throughout the hall. "We're talking about my daughter, my own daughter." The murmuring of the guests grew into a deafening buzz. Evelyn watched the scene with her heart pounding in her chest. She knew the confrontation wouldn't be easy, but seeing John like this, so hurt and furious, tore at her soul. Rebecca stood her ground, but Evelyn could see the fear in her eyes. She knew she was losing control. "John, don't be fooled." Rebecca tried to move closer, but John raised his hand to stop her. "Your mother, she just wants to turn you against me. She's been jealous from the start, because she can't accept that you have me now." John looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and contempt. "This has nothing to do with jealousy," he replied in a cold voice. "It has to do with the truth." He lifted the documents once more. "And the truth is that you lied to me, manipulated me, and tried to erase my own daughter's existence." Rebecca opened her mouth to respond, but William cut her off. "John, my boy," he said in a deep voice, stepping forward, "don't let your emotions get the best of you. Don't make any rash decisions. All of this can be resolved quietly and orderly." Quietly and orderly. John looked at him with pure hatred. "You've controlled me like a puppet, and now you want me to just sit back and accept it?" William raised his hands in a placating gesture, but the tension on his face was evident. "John, think carefully. If you do this now, If you break off with Rebecca, you'll lose everything. The company, the contracts, your position in the city. Everything will crumble. Evelyn stepped forward, placing a hand on her son's arm. John, sometimes there are things more important than money and status, she said softly, looking at him with all the love and pain she felt. Sometimes the truth is all we have. John looked at her and nodded slowly. Then he turned to face Rebecca and William, holding the documents firmly in his hand. I don't want to see either of you again. Not you, not your money. I'm keeping the only thing that truly matters. Sophie. With those words, he turned to Evelyn and nodded. Let's go find her. Take me to my daughter. Evelyn smiled through her tears and took his arm. They had won the first battle, but the war against the Stuarts was far from over. The grand hall of the Stuart mansion, illuminated by chandeliers and adorned with exotic flowers, had erupted into a frenzy of whispers and bewildered glances. The guests, who only minutes earlier had been enjoying the lavish wedding reception, now found themselves caught up in a completely unexpected spectacle. John, the groom, stood holding the will and letters that had just uncovered the Stuarts' darkest secret. Rebecca, the radiant bride who should have been savoring the best day of her life, was on the verge of collapse, her face pale and her eyes wide with fury and panic. Evelyn stayed close to her son, her heart pounding as she watched him confront Rebecca and William with the dignity of a man who had finally regained control of his life. All around them, the murmured conversations mixed with expressions of shock and horror. The guests, high society figures and business associates, watched with morbid fascination, as if witnessing the fall of an empire. "This can't be true," Rebecca shouted, raising her voice in a shrill tone that echoed through the hall. "These letters are fake." She turned to her father, seeking support, but William's gaze was dark, his face rigid like marble. John looked at her with an expression of deep contempt, his blue eyes blazing with barely suppressed rage. "Stop lying, Rebecca," he said quietly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Enough is enough. You kept my daughter hidden from me all this time. You put her through hell just to make sure I didn't find out the truth." He held the letters up for all to see. "These letters were written by Anne before she died. My daughter, Sophie, has been living under the same roof as me, and you never let me know." The murmur in the room grew louder, and some guests exchanged incredulous glances. A child. The groom had a daughter. Why hadn't anyone known about this? Evelyn saw some elegantly dressed women cover their mouths, whispering in low voices. The men leaned forward, speaking under their breath to their wives, their expressions of surprise slowly shifting into disgust toward the Stuarts. "John, please," Rebecca begged, her eyes now shimmering with tears she struggled to control. "You don't understand. Everything I did was for us, for our future. Sophie was—" She faltered, searching for the right words. "Sophie was a complication. I only wanted to protect you. I love you, John." "Protect me?" John let out a bitter laugh, a laugh that held no trace of humor. "Hiding my own daughter is protecting me? Telling her that her father never wanted her?" He leaned in closer, his voice trembling with rage. "You don't love me, Rebecca. You only love the control you have over me." Rebecca took a step back, as if she had been slapped. She turned to her father, who had been silent up until that moment. William Stuart stepped forward, raising his hands as if trying to defuse the situation. "John, listen to me," he said in his deep baritone voice, which usually commanded respect and obedience. "This is all a misunderstanding. You can't make rash decisions based on your mother's words. Think about what you're risking. Think about everything you've built." "Everything I've built?" John shook his head with a bitter smile. "I didn't build anything, did I?" He pointed at William, his voice rising so everyone could hear. "I was just another pawn on your chessboard, wasn't I? You moved the pieces and made me think I was in control, but you've been manipulating me from the start. William lifted his chin, his eyes narrowing. There was danger in his gaze, a silent warning. "Be careful, John," he murmured coldly. "Don't say things you'll regret." John took a step forward, pain and determination flashing across his face like a storm. "Regret?" His voice rose into a shout that echoed through the hall. "The only thing I regret is not seeing this sooner." He took the letters and the will and threw them to the ground between them. "You have no power over me anymore, and you have no right to tell me what I should do with my life." The murmuring in the room turned into a roar of voices. Some guests tried to slip away quietly, while others remained rooted in place, too fascinated to look away. Evelyn saw the guests' expressions turn more and more disapproving as they looked at Rebecca and William. Someone let out a small gasp, and Evelyn turned to see Margaret Spencer slowly making her way forward from the back of the hall. "Enough lies!" Margaret exclaimed, her voice firm and clear, drawing everyone's attention. "These documents are not fake." She bent down and picked up the letters John had thrown, holding them up high. "I witnessed the relationship between John and Anne. I know the truth. Sophie is his daughter." She turned to the guests, who stared at her in shock. "And this family, the Stuarts, have conspired to hide it from the beginning." William's face twisted in a furious scowl, but Margaret didn't stop. "This marriage was never about love," she continued, looking at John with compassion. "It was a business deal, an agreement to ensure that the Stuarts controlled everything." She pointed at Rebecca with disdain, and she was willing to ruin a little girl's life to make it happen. The murmurs turned into horrified gasps and shocked exclamations. Rebecca staggered back, her face drained of color. "No! No, it's not true!" she cried out desperately. "It's a lie!" But it was too late. The guests began rising from their seats, some heading toward the exit, shaking their heads, while others whispered in disbelief. The Stuarts' mask of perfection had shattered. Rebecca looked around frantically, as if searching for some way to save herself. "John, please," she begged, reaching out to him. "This is all a misunderstanding. I just wanted us to be happy. Think about our life together." John looked at her with an infinite sadness. "Our life together no longer exists, Rebecca." He turned to Evelyn and Margaret and nodded slowly. "I'm taking Sophie with me, and I don't want to see any of you again." Rebecca let out a scream of desperation, and before anyone could stop her, she lunged forward, trying to snatch the letters from Margaret's hands. But Evelyn moved quickly, stepping between them and clutching the purse tightly. "I won't let you hurt anyone else," Evelyn shouted, her voice ringing out with a strength she didn't know she possessed. Rebecca froze, her face twisted in fury and frustration. And then, as if realizing that she had lost everything, she let her arms drop to her sides and slowly backed away, tears of helpless rage streaming down her cheeks. You don't understand," she whispered, looking at John with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You can't do this. You can't just leave me like this." But John wasn't listening anymore. He turned to Evelyn and nodded firmly. "Let's go find Sophie," he said quietly, taking his mother's arm. Evelyn felt relief and sorrow mix in her heart as they left the hall together, leaving the Stuarts and all the pain they had caused behind. She knew the battle wasn't over. She knew that Rebecca and William would try to recover, that they wouldn't give up easily. But she also knew that John had regained something priceless, his dignity and his freedom. And as they walked through the mansion's halls in search of little Sophie, Evelyn allowed herself to smile, knowing that, for the first time in many years, there was hope that her family could be whole again. The murmurs and shouts still echoed through the main hall as Evelyn and John moved away from the chaos, leaving behind the empty opulence and the venom disguised as courtesy. Rebecca and William were now mere shadows of what they once represented, trapped in their own web of lies and deceit. But for John, the real challenge was just beginning. He walked with determined steps beside Evelyn, his face pale and his jaw clenched, as if every step toward the service quarters was a mix of hope and fear. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Evelyn whispered, as they turned down the hallway leading to the servants' wing. Despite everything that had happened, she didn't want to push him into facing something he wasn't ready for. John paused for a moment, took a deep breath, and closed his eyes, as if he needed to find a calm center amidst the whirlwind of emotions raging within him. When he opened them again, his gaze was clear and resolute. "I have to, Mom," he replied, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "I can't let Sophie suffer any longer because of my mistakes, because of my ignorance." Evelyn gently squeezed his arm, proud to see the determined man her son had become. She finally saw in him the same strength and resolve he had as a child, the same courage she had always believed he possessed, even though life and ambition had pulled him off the right path. "She needs you, John," she whispered with a small smile, "and you need her too." He swallowed hard and nodded, turning his gaze away as if he feared showing his vulnerability. Then, without saying another word, he headed toward the small service room door where Sophie had been hiding. As they approached, Evelyn felt her heart pounding in her chest. He stopped in front of the door and knocked softly once. "Sophie!" she called out gently, hoping not to frighten the little girl. "It's me, Evelyn. I'm here with your dad." There was a brief silence, and Evelyn held her breath, waiting for a response. Then she heard a small shuffling sound inside, a soft rustling, as if Sophie were curling deeper into her corner. Finally, the door cracked open, just enough for a pair of large, dark eyes to peer through the narrow gap. When Sophie saw Evelyn, her shoulders relaxed slightly, but when she noticed John standing beside her, the little girl took a step back, her eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. "Sophie," John's voice was broken, his expression reflecting a pain that Evelyn had never seen before. I'm your dad." The girl blinked, her whole body tense, as if she were ready to run. She didn't say anything, only stared at him with a mix of curiosity and doubt, as if unsure whether to believe him or not. "I'm sorry," John continued, taking a small step forward but stopping when he saw her flinch. "I'm so sorry, sweetheart." His voice trembled with emotion, and Evelyn could see tears welling up in his eyes. "I didn't know you were here. I didn't know that you existed. If I had known..." He ran a hand over his face, trying to steady himself. "If I had known, I would never have left you alone. I would never have let them hurt you." Sophie watched him silently, her large eyes blinking slowly as she processed what he was saying. Then, very slowly, her gaze shifted to Evelyn, as if looking for confirmation. Evelyn nodded softly, giving her a reassuring smile. "It's true, sweetheart," she said in a gentle voice. "John didn't know anything. Rebecca and her family lied to him. But now he's here. He's here for you." The girl blinked again, and with cautious movements, slowly stepped out from her hiding place. She was small for her age, with dark hair falling in messy strands around her pale face. Her cheeks were streaked with dried tears, and her clothes were wrinkled, as if she had spent far too much time alone in that tiny corner of the house. John looked at her with eyes full of pain, as if seeing her fragility tore him apart inside. Are you my dad?" Sophie finally asked, her voice barely a whisper. John swallowed and knelt in front of her, bringing himself down to her eye level. The tears he had been holding back finally spilled down his cheeks, but he made no attempt to wipe them away. "Yes, Sophie," he whispered, his voice shaking. "I'm your dad, and I'm here now." He reached out his hand toward her, but didn't touch her, letting her decide whether to approach or not. "I won't let them take you away. I won't let anyone hurt you. I promise." Sophie stayed motionless for a moment, her eyes studying every detail of his face. There was so much fear and pain in her small expression that Evelyn felt her heart break again and again. But then, very slowly, Sophie raised a trembling hand and placed it on top of John's. He let out a small sob, bowing his head as he gently squeezed her tiny fingers. You won't leave me," Sophie whispered, her voice so soft it was almost inaudible. John lifted his head again, his eyes blazing with fierce intensity. "Never. I'll never leave you, Sophie." He leaned in closer, looking at her with all the love and desperation he felt. "I'll protect you. I'll take care of you. I'll do everything I can to be the father you deserve." For a moment, there was absolute silence in the small room. Evelyn watched, holding back her own tears as Sophie and John looked at each other, as if recognizing each other for the first time. Then, suddenly, Sophie let out a small sob and threw herself forward, wrapping her tiny arms around John's neck. John hugged her tightly, his body shaking with the silent sobs he tried to suppress. "Daddy," Sophie whispered against his shoulder, her tears soaking into John's jacket. "Don't let them take me away. Please." "I won't, sweetheart. I won't." John hugged her even tighter, as if afraid she might disappear if he let go. "I'm here. I'm here now." Evelyn felt the tears roll down her own cheeks as she watched the reunion of father and daughter. After all the pain and confusion, John had found the most precious thing he could have lost, the chance to be a real father. And Sophie, the little girl who had grown up in the darkness of rejection and loneliness, finally had someone who would protect her with his life. But Evelyn knew this was only the beginning. Rebecca and William wouldn't sit idly by. They would try to regain control, to destroy John, and drag Sophie back into her cage of lies. But Evelyn was determined to fight. This time, she wouldn't let anyone come between her and the happiness of her son and granddaughter. "John," she murmured softly, placing a hand on his shoulder as she watched them with tenderness. "We need to go. Right now." John looked up, his face wet with tears, and nodded. "Yes, Mom. You're right." He stood slowly, carefully lifting Sophie into his arms, as if she were the most precious treasure in the world. The girl clung to him tightly, her small face buried in his neck, as if afraid that all of this might just be a dream that would vanish at any moment. Evelyn glanced around cautiously. She knew the Stewarts were still in the mansion, probably trying to calm the guests and contain the damage. But they couldn't stay any longer. They had to leave before someone tried to stop them. "I know a way out through the back garden," Evelyn whispered, taking John's hand and leading him down the corridor. Together, they moved quickly through the hallways, avoiding the curious glances of the servants and the commotion of the main hall. When they finally stepped into the cool night air, Evelyn felt a great weight lift from her shoulders. She turned to John, who held Sophie tenderly, and nodded. "Let's go home," she said softly, looking at her son and granddaughter. "From now on, we'll do things our way." John smiled faintly, his eyes filled with hope. "Yes, Mom. From now on, things will be different." And with those words, they walked away from the Stewart mansion, leaving behind the pain and betrayal and starting a new journey as the family they were always meant to be. The following weeks were a whirlwind of change for John, Evelyn, and Sophie. After leaving the Stewarts' mansion that night, John wasted no time cutting himself off from Rebecca and William's control. He resigned from his position in the company and severed all ties with them, knowing that each step brought him closer to an uncertain future, but one that was finally free. Rebecca tried contacting him repeatedly, threatening to ruin his life and take away everything he owned. But John stood firm. Together, they moved to a small house on the outskirts of the city, a modest but warm home where sunlight streamed through the windows and the air smelled of freedom and new possibilities. Evelyn felt rejuvenated watching John and Sophie get to know each other and grow closer every day. Sophie, who had been so timid and scared at first, began to smile, speak more confidently, and laugh with the carefree joy that every child deserves. "Dad, can I go play outside?" she asked one day, looking up at John with those big, dark eyes now brimming with happiness instead of fear. John gazed at her tenderly and nodded, leaning down to place a gentle kiss on her forehead. "Of course, sweetheart, but don't go too far," he reminded softly. Evelyn, watching the scene from the kitchen, felt a deep warmth in her chest. She couldn't help but smile as she saw the bond between father and daughter strengthen day by day. All the sacrifice and pain they had endured had been worth it. When Sophie dashed out into the small yard, laughing gleefully, John walked over to his mother. They both watched the little girl play through the window, the sunlight bathing her hair in a golden glow. "I could never thank you enough, Mom," John said quietly, looking at Evelyn with a mixture of gratitude and regret. "If it weren't for you, I would have kept living in that lie. I would have lost Sophie forever." Evelyn shook her head gently, placing a hand on John's. "Don't thank me, son," she said, smiling at him proudly. "You're the one who took the steps to change. You're the one who chose to be a real father." John squeezed his mother's hand, his eyes filled with emotion. "I've made so many mistakes," he murmured, turning his gaze to the little girl playing outside. "But now I have the chance to make things right, to be someone worthy, for her and for you." "You already are, John," Evelyn said firmly, making him look at her again. "All Sophie needs is her father. And now, at last, you are." John nodded slowly, as if her words gave him a sense of calm and renewed strength. Then, without letting go of Evelyn's hand, he turned to her with a smile she hadn't seen since he was a child. "Mom," he said softly, "I want you to know that, no matter what happens, I'll never push you away again. This house is your home. Sophie needs her grandmother as much as she needs me." He lowered his gaze for a moment, his lips trembling. "And I need you too." Evelyn felt tears welling up in her eyes, but they were tears of joy, of relief. Finally, after so many years of separation and pain, she had her son back, and she had a family she had fought for, and that was now complete. "I'll always be here for both of you," she whispered, raising her hand to gently caress John's cheek. "Always." The sound of Sophie's laughter interrupted them, and they both turned to see her running after a small ball in the yard. The sun was shining, the air was filled with the scent of spring flowers, and Evelyn felt that, for the first time in many years, everything was right. John released Evelyn's hand and walked toward the back door. "Sophie, would you like me to play with you?" he asked with a warm smile. The little girl turned around, her face lighting up with joy. "Yes, Daddy. Come play with me." Evelyn stayed at the door, watching them as they ran across the lawn, laughing and shouting in pure happiness. She placed a hand over her heart, feeling it swell with peace and contentment she thought she would never feel again. All the pain, all the sacrifice, all the suffering had been worth it. Because now, at long last, she had everything she had ever wanted. A united family, filled with love and hope. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Evelyn made a silent promise to herself that she would always protect this love, no matter what. "Welcome home, Evelyn," she whispered softly, smiling through her tears. Because in the end, no matter how far one has gone, love always finds its way back home. Thank you for joining us in this heartfelt story of love, redemption, and second chances. If this touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to reclaim what truly matters. See you in the next story, filled with emotions and life lessons. Until next time.